May it please the court, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is why we're all gathered here today in this courtroom, for Carlos, to figure out what happened to Carlos, because the evidence is going to show that on April 14th, 2024, this defendant, Kevin Lychwick, murdered him. He shot him twice, once in the torso and once in the center of Carlos's face. This is a picture of Carlos. This was a much better day for him than April 14th, 2024. And I think it's important before we talk about the facts of this case to give you a little bit of information about who Carlos was as an individual in life before we talk about what tragically happened to him. Carlos lived in an apartment at 1512 East North Street here in Waukesha. It's actually just a stone's throw away from this courthouse. It's just down the hill. Some of you may have even driven past this apartment complex when you came to court a little bit earlier this morning. Carlos was just 55 years old on the day that he was murdered. He had goals in life. He was planning to start his own business, and he was very, very close with his daughter, Talisa. In fact, him and Talisa enjoyed going to different restaurants together. They enjoyed going to different Mexican restaurants. They enjoyed trying chips and salsa from every single Mexican restaurant that they went to, and that's how they would determine whether a restaurant was a good one or not. The relationship between Carlos and his daughter had never been better at the time of this incident, before he was tragically taken in this case. April 14th, 2024 is the day that the evidence in this case is going to show when this homicide took place. What you're going to hear is that on that particular morning, the evidence will show that Carlos got up that morning and went to a hardware store where he made a purchase. We know this because there was surveillance footage that captured him at this particular hardware store. We also know from his bank statements that he made a purchase on April 14th, 2024. We also know that after he finished his transaction at the hardware store, he returned to his apartment. And we know this because there was an apartment manager. Her name is Glenda Rose, and you're going to hear from her very early on in this case. She'll be one of our first witnesses. She actually witnessed Carlos in the garage area of the apartment complex cutting wood, and she actually greeted him. So we know that he made it back from the hardware store to the apartment complex where he lived. Unfortunately, after Glenda saw Carlos in the garage area, Carlos was never seen alive again. And despite many family members, including Talisa, his daughter, trying to figure out where he was, nobody heard from him. Talisa actually reported him missing, because it was out of character for Carlos to actually not contact his daughter. This was something that whenever Talisa called Carlos, at this point, Carlos was always very prompt in terms of getting back to her. So the fact that she had attempted to call her father and he hadn't gotten back to her, that was very suspicious. So there was a period of time in which several months nobody knew where Carlos was, nobody had heard from him. We were trying to find him. And October 30th, 2024 is when we made a very startling discovery. What happened on that day and what the evidence will show is that there was a gentleman named Nathan Poley. Mr. Poley is a resident at 1512 East North Street, the same apartment complex that both Carlos and Mr. Lychwick lived at the time of this murder. And Mr. Poley was also a maintenance worker at that particular complex as well. And so what Mr. Poley was doing on this particular day was he was doing some yard work in the wooded area behind this particular apartment complex. So to give you a little bit of a sense of what this complex is like, this is a 2-level complex. There's units on the ground floor, and then there's a second level, and then there's additional apartment units on the second level. And then bordered to the back of that complex is a giant hill with some woods in the back area. So Mr. Poley was in this wooded area. He was doing some yard work, and he came across this blue tarp that you see depicted in this photo. And at first, Mr. Poley didn't think anything of this blue tarp. He thought it was just something that somebody had thrown away. But as he got a little bit closer to it, he made a shocking discovery. Underneath the tarp was Carlos's remains. And the tarp was covered, you're going to hear, in sticks, branches, and other foliage, almost as if the person who had set it there did so intentionally in order to hide what was under that blue tarp. The police get called because Mr. Poley reports what he found to the apartment manager, and the police are called, and the police respond to the scene, And ultimately, Carlos is determined to be the individual whose remains were found under that tarp because dental records were able to positively identify him as such. His autopsy was performed on November 1st. There's going to be a medical examiner that's going to testify in this case for you as well. The medical examiner is going to tell you that she found trauma associated with Carlos, that she found a firearm projectile that was located attached to Carlos's scalp. There were entrance and exit wounds, and that there was a second projectile that was found under Carlos's torso area as well, and that he had an injury to his lower vertebrae that was consistent with a gunshot wound as well. Given the length of time that Carlos was missing from April to October, his body was in a very severely decomposed state. And unfortunately, we'll have to show you some pictures of that, but that's what happened in this case as well. So now we have this homicide. We have this body in the woods, and the Waukesha police are now involved, and they're investigating this. And they're at a disadvantage, is what you're going to hear, because of the length of time between when Carlos disappears and when he's ultimately discovered. So the police are really behind the eight ball here. They have to hustle to really uncover evidence and follow leads and make sure that they're identifying the person who's responsible for this. They start to investigate. They interview several people at the apartment complex. They canvass the area. And to be frank with you, for a while there, it wasn't looking very good. They were having some difficulty figuring out who did this, what were the circumstances surrounding this. They knew it was a homicide, but they didn't know who actually was responsible for this. And then what you're going to hear is they caught a huge break. And the break came in the form of a gentleman named Anthony Lefebvre. And for the court reporter, that's spelled Lefebvre. Anthony, you're going to hear, was a resident at this particular apartment complex as well. And Anthony had a trail camera. And Anthony had been given permission by the apartment complex to build a garden in the wooded hill area behind the complex. And in order to keep tabs on this garden that he was building and to show the progress with family members, Anthony also set up a trail camera with the apartment complex's permission. And the footage on the camera dated all the way back to April 29th, 2024. So just a couple of weeks after Carlos went missing, and the evidence will show he was murdered on that particular day. The police came out and they saw the trail camera. And then they said, hey, we'd like to take a look at that footage just to see if there's anybody on that camera. And Anthony was very cooperative. He gave the police the footage, as you're going to hear, and the investigators reviewed it. And what they found on that trail camera was the defendant, Mr. Lychwick, walking around the area where Carlos's remains were found at very odd hours of the night. They saw the defendant carrying a white trash bag. They saw him suspiciously looking in windows of the apartment complex as if he was looking to see if somebody was watching what he was doing. He was seen in one clip, and you're going to see this as well as part of the state's presentation of evidence. He was wearing boots. At one point, he was kicking an item off his boots after he was seen walking in the area where Carlos's body was ultimately discovered. And he also was carrying some sort of tool. We don't exactly know what tool it was because of the quality of the video footage, but he's definitely carrying a tool as well. So the police now start to look into Mr. Lychwick because, this is suspicious, right? And we're trying to see if this is the individual who's responsible for murdering Carlos. And once they start to look into Mr. Lychwick, they make many shocking and incriminating discoveries based on the evidence. So what Detective Stern and I did last week in preparation for this case is we sat down and we highlighted together, we came up with a list of what we think are going to be the most compelling pieces of evidence that you're going to hear. It's not all the evidence that you're going to hear in this case, but this is what we believe are the most compelling pieces of evidence that you're going to hear that point towards Mr. Lychwick's guilt in this case. First piece of evidence that the police found in this case was a note. The police went and got a warrant. They got a search warrant to search Mr. Lychwick's apartment to either confirm or dispel their suspicions that he may have been involved in this homicide. What they found, and you'll hear more about this during the state's presentation of testimony, was several documents that were handwritten with several quote-unquote operations listed on them. One of these pieces of paper, and you see it depicted here on this photo as well, contained information about an operation named Operation Slop Shop. You'll see it at the top of this exhibit as well. Specifically, as it relates to Operation Slop Shop, the piece of paper that was found in the defendant's apartment, where, by the way, he lives alone, he does not have a roommate, specifically names Carlos as a, quote, threat. There was an additional piece of paper as well describing another operation. This particular piece of paper indicated that Operation Slop Shop had been completed and that the threats from that first stop had been, quote, neutralized. There were additional pieces of paper as well found in in the defendant, Mr. Lychwick's apartment as well. There were several other operations listed with many other individuals. The important piece is that those individuals you're going to hear had connections to Mr. Lychwick. So if the idea is that he didn't write the note, well, you're going to hear that several of the individuals listed on these notes, again, were connected to him. And then when the police were serving the warrant on Mr. Lychwick, at Mr. Lychwick's apartment as well, you don't always get Perry Mason moments, in the middle of trial. But this case, we actually have one of them. Because when the police were serving the warrant, Mr. Lychwick was given a copy of the search warrant for his particular apartment, a courtesy copy, if you will. What we do in Waukesha County is we try not to include victims' names in court documents because they have a right to privacy. We want to make sure that we're not unknowingly exposing their name or their information to the public for their own protection. So the search warrant that was given to Mr. Lychwick only said Victim A. That's all it said, Victim A. Yet, you're going to hear that when Mr. Lychwick was given a copy of that warrant and he looked at it, he exclaimed, quote, "Carlos Maldonado, I had nothing to do with that." At that point, we had not made public the fact that Mr. Maldonado's body was the individual that we had located on the grounds of 1512 East North Street. The evidence is going to show that only the killer would have known that Mr. Maldonado was the individual who was on that grounds when Mr. Lychwick made that statement. Another compelling piece of information that we found in this case was a storage unit. Now, during this investigation, the police looked into a bunch of different things as it relates to the defendant. We looked at his purchase history. We looked at how he was spending his money to see if there was anything that was suspicious as well from an investigative standpoint. Mr. Lychwick was on a pretty tight budget. This is what we found from looking at his banking records. He was living on SSI. Yet, the evidence is going to show that on November 1st, 2024, just 3 days after we discovered Carlos's remains at the apartment complex. Remember, he was found on October 30th. So just 3 days later, what we found is that the defendant drove all the way up to the Fox Cities area. He drove to the Kimberly area, and he took advantage of a 1-month free promotion to rent a storage unit in Kimberly, Wisconsin. We know that on November 1st, from what we found in his phone, that he was spending hours searching for storage units here in Waukesha County. We know, as I stated, he was on a tight budget. He was budgeting about $50 for gas. This trip, round trip to go from Kimberly back to Waukesha County would have greatly blown through his gas budget. Yet, we know that he went all the way to Kimberly, and you're going to hear from the representatives from the U-Haul as well, and he rented that storage unit. Okay? But he didn't rent it for very long, because 1 month later, after the free month had expired, and you're going to hear evidence to this effect as well, the defendant is seen on surveillance footage going back to the U-Haul storage facility and closing out that U-Haul unit that he had rented. Again, you're going to hear from an employee who helped him with that process. You're going to hear that the defendant was in a rush. He wanted to get out of there as soon as possible, and he cleared out the entirety of that storage unit as well. And then he made his way back to Waukesha County. What he didn't know at that time was that the police had obtained a GPS warrant for his car. So when he left Waukesha County and traveled to the Fox Cities, the police were following him. They wanted to see what he was up to. And so what they ultimately did was they effectuated a stop, and then they seized the vehicle that he was driving as well from Outagamie County all the way back to Waukesha County. And then they found the holy grail of evidence. The evidence is going to show in the defendant's vehicle. They found in the trunk of his vehicle, after they went and got a search warrant, by the way, so they seized the vehicle, but the police then went and got a search warrant. They searched the trunk of his vehicle, and they found, and you see it depicted here at the bottom of this picture as well, a 1939 Luger firearm. And the police did two things with this particular firearm. They're going to be very, very important in this case. The first thing they did is they packaged up this firearm, and then they mailed it to the state crime lab, in Milwaukee. And there's an individual who works at the crime lab by the name of Jessica Crawford. She's a firearms and markings expert is her title. And so what she did, and you're going to hear from her as well throughout this case about her process as well, you're going to hear that Ms. Crawford tested this firearm and found, despite it being a very old firearm, that it was fully functional. It was working just fine. It was capable of recycling rounds through and firing bullets. But the other thing, and this is perhaps even more important than the fact that the Luger was fully functional, Ms. Crawford took two projectiles that we recovered from Carlos. The one that came out of his head from the autopsy, and then the one that was found under him in the tarp where his body was discovered at the apartment complex. She had both of those projectiles. And then she had, in addition, her own library of ammunition that she had in the lab as well. So she test fired the rounds that she had from her library of ammunition, and then she compared those rounds with the two projectiles that we know went through Carlos. And what she found, and what she's going to testify to, is that both projectiles bear markings that are similar. And when a gun is recycled through a firearm, through the barrel of a firearm, it leaves certain markings so that you know that it came from that particular firearm. Never has it happened in the history of firearms that a bullet has bared the same markings, and she will tell you this, that came from two separate guns. So the bullets that we pulled out of Carlos came from the weapon that we found in the defendant's trunk of his car. But we're not done, because not only did the police send the gun for testing, they also swabbed the gun for DNA. And they sent the DNA swabs that they tested. And they also had Mr. Lychwick's DNA as well. That was obtained pursuant to a buccal swab as well. They sent that to the lab as well. And what they found, there was a DNA expert that actually tested this as well. And each person has their own DNA profile, right? The only exception to that is if you have an identical twin, which is not true in this case. Mr. Lychwick's DNA profile was found on that murder weapon that was in his truck, or it was in his vehicle, And what you're going to hear is that it was a single source DNA profile, not a mixture where multiple people are contributing to this profile, but a single source DNA profile. And that the lab's conclusion was that there was very strong potential for inclusion, that Mr. Lychwick's DNA was the profile that was found on that murder weapon. That is the highest support, that you will have the highest probability of standard that the lab has in terms of DNA. And the DNA expert will explain more to you this as well. We also, as part of this investigation, obtained Mr. Lychwick's phone. We wanted to see what he was searching on his phone. People search for all kinds of things on their phones, right? And we found some very incriminating searches on his phone as well. First and foremost, a brief just housekeeping matter regarding the email address. Conrad Lychwick, you're going to hear testimony in this case that although the defendant's legal name is Kevin, he prefers to be called Conrad. In fact, you're going to hear that he would correct people when they would call him Kevin rather than Conrad. So not only do we know that this is his phone, because we wrote a warrant and were able to look at what he was searching, we also know that that's his email address. And so that was associated with his phone as well. And what we found when we looked at his phone was some very suspicious findings. 1 week, just 1 week after Carlos was never seen again, was never heard from, we have the defendant searching carcass movement, processing and disposal. How can I dispose of spoiled food safely? Large plastic bags and where to find them. Maps of landfill in Wisconsin. This is very suspicious, and from the state's perspective, we believe the evidence will show that this is because he was making certain measures to see how he could dispose of Carlos's body after he had killed him. And there were additional certain things on his phone that were incriminating as well. November 25th, 2024, he went to Google. His phone went to Google and searched Waukesha News for November shooting. There had been no shootings in Waukesha County at that time, and we hadn't made public the fact that Carlos's death was by virtue of a shooting as well. Once again, much like the comment that he made during the execution of the search warrant at his house, only the killer would know this sort of information. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's two counts, as Judge Moss just explained to you. There's first-degree intentional homicide, and then there's the second count of hiding a corpse. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this as well. You'll get the full jury instructions at the conclusion of the case at the evidence. But I just want to just define a couple of these terms for you as you listen to the evidence. So the term cause, the first word in that, means that the defendant's conduct was a substantial factor in causing Carlos's death. Well, the evidence is going to prove to you that he shot him twice. Shooting somebody twice, once in the face area, pretty obvious, right? That's going to cause somebody to die as a result of that. And then intent to kill, again, you have the mental purpose to take the life of another human being, or you're practically certain that your conduct is going to cause the death of another human being. Again, I've already touched on this. We have the notes from the apartment talking about operations and neutralizing specific targets. I didn't use the word motive, and Judge Moss already explained this to you. I'm not going to repeat that. Motive is different from intent. We have to prove intent to you, but we don't have to prove motive. Now, that's stated more simply, we don't have to prove why he did it, but we have to prove that he did it and he acted with intent. And you'll get a jury instruction on that as well. And then we have the second count of hiding a corpse. You see the elements up there as well. You're going to hear from Detective Stern in this case. I've already touched on this about the location of the pile that had Carlos's remains in it. You're going to hear that it was Detective Stern's conclusion that that pile was deliberately set there. We will show you a number of pictures. You'll be able to see that there were twigs and other things and branches and things over top of this pile, almost as if the individual who put it there did not want this pile to be found. And again, we'll show you evidence on that as well. And again, the fact of the trail cameras that I've touched on earlier as well, the fact that the defendant was seen walking around in this area at very odd times of night, when there was nobody out. Again, evidence of that as well. So that's the second count. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to conclude with this. You're going to hear from a number of witnesses. You're going to hear from police officers. You're going to hear from specialists. You're going to hear from eyewitnesses. You're going to hear from people who worked on this case. We have a DNA expert. We have a firearms expert. We have a medical examiner, a cadaver dog expert, a botany expert, and even a forensic anthropologist. So this is going to be a lot of experts that's going to come in and testify. The evidence is going to show that this investigation was not a rush to judgment. This was not a giant conspiracy. This is not an attempt by the Waukesha Police Department to railroad Mr. Lychwick. The police put a lot of time and a lot of effort into this case, and it was ultimately the conclusion that they had by following the evidence that Mr. Lychwick was the individual who was responsible for murdering Carlos in this case. It's the conclusion that is only supported by the evidence that we're going to present to you. And as we were sitting down and thinking about what is the most, proper or perhaps the best framework to present this, we came up with the idea of a puzzle. When you sit down to do a puzzle and you put the first couple of pieces in this particular puzzle, you may not be able to see, the full picture of the puzzle. But as you add pieces to it, and in this case the pieces would be the evidence that we're going to present to you, and you hear more and more about the evidence that we have and how we present it in, then you start to see the bigger picture emerges. The puzzle starts to come in full focus. And that's what this case is. So Googling, for example, how to dispose of spoiled food safely, may seem pretty innocuous. But when you consider all of the other evidence that we're going to present, what it is it shows, it's just one more piece of the puzzle, showing that Mr. Lychwick is the individual who's responsible for the murder in this case. And I'll leave you with this. When you've heard all this evidence, and we've had an opportunity to address you in closing, and we're going to come before you and ask you to find Mr. Lychwick guilty of both of these serious counts in this case, I want you to keep in mind all the evidence that we're going to present to you. Because for all this evidence that we're going to show you, and I haven't shown you everything, right? We've just shown you some of the most compelling pieces of evidence. For all this pieces of evidence to be true, and for Mr. Lychwick not to be the individual responsible for murdering Carlos, he has to be the unluckiest man in the world. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.